and welcome to today's episode that deals with the structure and function of a newsroom of a daily. The subject expert today is Renu Agal, who has worked for 2 decades in a number of leading newspapers and the BBC World Service and is now an independent journalist and associated with the publishing industry. And I am Sakshi Mandwal. In this episode, we will look at the shape of a newsroom. Who all constitute it and how does it function? How are decisions on what is news taken and what gets priority? Who is responsible for the final newspaper coming out of the printing press and into our homes? What are the factors which affect the decisions a newsroom takes and how does it maintain quality of output and fairness of reporting? In a quickly changing market, how are the sources of news changing and what are the new constraints dailies face? And how are they striving to maintain their independence and viability? We will look at how the newsroom functions, how it is structured, what is the role played by different people in the making of a newspaper. A newsroom can be described as the core of a newspaper. Over here, news is gathered from various sources and reports are prepared for publishing. News stories are gathered here, written, compiled, edited and finally assembled to print. So, it is the main nerve center where editorial decisions are taken. This is one point where decisions are made on what makes news, what needs to be printed and how much space is to be given to particular piece of news. So, the final shape in which you see the newspaper at your doorstep in the morning is conceived in a newsroom. The number of people working in a newsroom depends on the size of the daily. Broadly, it would have journalists, reporters, photographers, sub-editors and rewriters who comprise what is called the newspaper's desk. At the top of a newspaper newsroom pyramid is the editor. They can be called managing editors, executive editors or resident editors. If you see the print line of a newspaper, it has the name of a resident editor. This is the person who has the final responsibility for what appears in a newspaper and is responsible for all its content. The managing editor manages staff, which could be anything between less than a dozen to several hundreds depending on the size of the newspaper. He then creates a structure where he has various editors looking after different departments. A political editor, sports editor, features editor, business editor, city editor and so on. He usually has assistant editors, a deputy resident editor, news editor, chief sub-editors, senior sub-editors and sub-editors. In journalistic parlance, they are known as desk people. They give a final shape to the stories. But the content comes in a large degree from that part of the newsroom which is called reporting. It comprises the bureau chief, the chief reporter, special correspondents, senior reporters and reporters. If it is a big national newspaper, then it has a team of correspondents and stringers in different states and cities to provide news inputs. A newspaper could also have foreign correspondents. Apart from their own news gathering teams, a newspaper also depends on agencies for news. In today's world, a lot of news comes from television and online sources. Apart from this, there is a design team which can have a cartoonist, illustrator, graphic designer. These are the people who look after the look of the paper. Then there is a photo desk with photo editors and photographers who click news pictures and also build a library of news pictures. The newsroom is a group enterprise where cooperation is the name of the game. All those who work in the newsroom find that there is a lot of interdependence and they cannot work as islands unto themselves. In a newsroom, managing editors are usually those who supervise, mediate and arbiter. They hire and fire, sanction projects, keep peace amongst the staff and liaise and coordinate with other departments of a newspaper. They are the face of the newspaper for the outside world. They get this onerous job done by getting their lieutenants in place. For example, the city editor gets to know from the reporters what's on the agenda. He decides whether it merits a space in the newspaper and directs the reporters to get the story. And he in turn then lists the stories to the news editor, who after getting information from different editors designs the page and decides the placement of the stories. The managing or resident editor gets to know of the plan in an editorial meeting and gives the agenda a thumbs up. But since news breaks keep happening, the agenda set at the start of the day often changes by the time the newspaper goes to print. And the news editor is hands-on with all the changes in the news agenda. Now, let us look at the rough roles of various people who form the newsroom. The sub-editor and the senior sub-editors are the building blocks on which a good newspaper functions. Senior sub-editors and sub-editors make sure that they get the layout, style and tone of the newspaper right. Their job is to process copy before it is published to ensure that it is grammatically and factually correct and reads well. They also lay out the story on the page, write headings and are often involved with the overall page design, depending on the size of the newspaper and the number of people it employs. This job requires an eye for detail, a lot of attention and fast pace of working. A good sub has to be an all-rounder who can put a story together with speed and in the in-house style. Depending on the size of the organization, the sub-editor has to edit copy written by reporters and feature writers. He removes the grammatical errors and spelling mistakes. The sub has also to cut the story or increase it to the desired length. A good sub-editor also has to have a way with words. He gives the headlines which not just captures the essence of the story but also are witty and clever. He also liaises with the reporters to clarify doubts in a story. They check facts of stories too. If they feel anything is libelous or if it is a copyright infringement or against company policy, he refers it to his seniors. The sub-editor also writes picture captions, crops pictures to put on the page, sees that the page plan is adhered to and stories go at their designated spots. They also proofread the pages and edit press releases and turn them around to readable news copies. So, the sub-editor is the foundation on which a newspaper stands. A good sub makes dry dull facts interesting, guards the newspaper against libel, grammatical errors, misinterpretations. He has to be a responsible individual who is also creative and talented. News comes from various sources. To streamline operations, the news desk is divided into many sections. The general desk is the first point to sort out the incoming news. It looks after the front page and national pages of a newspaper. Then there are the other desks: foreign, regional, city, business, sports and edit, page 3 and so on, which take care of the news or articles of their respective fields. And each desk has a chief sub-editor in charge. Those chief sub-editors who are handling the front page also sometimes bear the responsibility of making the edition. The chief sub selects news items, prioritizes it, gets it processed, and decides the page look and slots the news items on the respective pages. The chief sub assigns the subs and senior subs work and also takes care of the finished product. The news editor is arguably the most important person in a daily newspaper. A paper's news coverage and outlook is defined by the news editor. His task is to maintain a smooth news flow and news gathering mechanism. Though most news trickles in regularly through a system of agencies, reporters' inputs and press notes, but a good news editor helps in getting exclusives which make a newspaper distinct from the others. He has the onerous task of selecting from thousands of stories which come through various sources. So, he has to be imaginative, understand what the public wants to decide and what makes news for his paper. He has to direct his reporters to get exclusive stories, investigations, features which make a newspaper's reputation. He has to ensure the factual correctness and quality of journalism in the paper. He not only has to be good at his game, but watch out for rivals in the industry. He has to see to it that his newspaper has not missed any stories and that his newspaper gets the scoops and not just follows stories. He assigns reporters the stories they need to do and also keeps a couple of reporters handy so that they can be used in case of a news break. He also regularly meets up with the editor, photo editor and heads of other departments and the correspondents in the field. So, the editorial content of a newspaper is driven to a large extent by factors like how newsy is the day, the space taken up by advertisements, amount of information available and how close is it to the deadline. The exclusiveness of a newspaper depends on the able shoulders of the reporters and correspondents. They provide the newspaper with its character and identity. Their stories can build the newspaper's reputation and any wrong reporting by them can also land the newspaper into trouble. They come up with their stories from their regions and beats and are often requested to follow up and report on suggestions given by the news editors and editors. Reporters report on news, politics, culture, sport, science, amongst other issues. They also write about local and national events, entertainment, lifestyle and human interest stories. Correspondents cover specific geographical areas and on specialist subjects, and feature writers produce in-depth pieces in their distinctive styles. They interview people, build contacts with police, emergency services, press officers, local councils, other organizations to get their stories. They also attend press conferences, do investigative stories, react to breaking stories. They work in close cooperation with the editors and photographers and write copies in the house style of the newspapers. The design team helps in the look of the paper. They help design pages and get graphics, maps and other factoids in pleasing form in the newspaper. The photographers work in close cooperation of the editorial desk and often go with reporters and correspondents to get the relevant pictures. They also shoot pictures for the paper even if there are no reporters covering it. Photographs are often carried as standalone pieces on many pages, and many times newspapers carry photo features to tell a story. So, we have noticed how the roles of different characters in the newsroom theatre are varied and how they bring us the news. In that way, they open a window to the world for all of us. D.M. White in the 1950s looked at the sub-editor as the gatekeeper in selecting certain stories and spiking others. Then, it was found that not just the sub-editors, but most people working in a news organization seemed to be guided by the same principles. So, the theory moved from individual bias in news selection to organizational bias arising through the production process. When journalists talk about selection of news, they often use the term called a nose for the news. This basically makes heroes out of newsmen. But we all know that there are very few heroes. Peter Golding says, there is an awful lot of history and not many great men. So, we need to look at organizations and their political and economic environment to understand what makes news for a certain organization. There is a lot said about creativity and enterprise, but a great deal of what appears in a newspaper is a result of routine procedures and information gathering. The pressure of deadlines and the importance of obtaining information rich in news values leads to an increased dependency upon official sources. With cost cuts and trimming of budgets, the dependence of news editors on agency copies grows, especially foreign news. Very few newspapers employ foreign correspondents. So, the worldview that a newspaper carries is actually that of a handful of agencies. Journalists often learn to select those items which they think will sell. Sex, violence, unusual sensational stories will more often than not find space in the newspaper. And so will a big story. Also, most newsrooms depend on a great deal on the diary. Basically, pre-planning of the news agenda. The diary would have anniversaries, important historical dates, forthcoming events, political calendar, conferences and summits, and sporting events which are then covered according to a plan. As more and more pre-planning enters newsrooms, more and more dependence increases on these events. This increase in production line journalism is also being tapped by some sources more than others to offer news. Journalists complain of pressure to deliver stories that sell, so the newsrooms now often tend to go for the sensational than in-depth, rigorous, research-based journalism. Ian Jack, a former newspaper editor and respected name in the British press, says, "In an unforgiving market, all of them perceive the need to be more popular and therefore more dramatic, playful and human. A sort of warmth has been achieved at the expense of credibility and trust." John Pilger, known for his fierce campaigning journalism, mourns the loss of popular journalism with a social conscience. But some argue that it is not dumbing down of newspapers, but democratization of news formats, which in earlier days betrayed cultural elitism. Let us find out, how is the newsroom doing today? Is it playing the role of the fourth estate with the vigor it should? And also, what are the problems and compulsions faced by newspaper editors in running the show? We will talk to Madhukar Upadhyay, senior journalist and former editor of Arch Samaj newspaper, and who is a scholar in residence in Jamia Millia Islamia. He has a long experience of running newsrooms in a cross-section of media. What are the problems faced by editors in holding on to strong journalism?
Basically, if you look at it, there are three things that can happen to any editor, which any editor faces every day in his journalistic pursuits. One is money power, because the editor is not necessarily the owner of the paper. So, the money is coming from somewhere else. He is editing the paper. So, the interest of the owner of or the proprietor or the person who is invested in the venture is something which comes out as a problem. Second is influence or influence from outside, maybe political, maybe economic, maybe their corporate pressures. So that is something which the editors face and tackle on a day-to-day basis. And third is ideology. Suppose the proprietor's ideology, the editor's ideology do not match, then there is a problem.
How much of pressure from lobby groups, vested interests work on editors?
Quite a lot, in fact. These pressures, I am not saying they work always, but I am saying the pressures are there, any given day, any given hour. You would have corporate lobbies dealing with, you had cases of corporate lobbies drawn into media. I am not taking names, but recently there was a story about a particular corporate lobbies talking on telephone to various journalists and editors and trying to influence, going up to the extent of deciding about who would be the minister for such a such portfolio. Now that pressure also works on the editors, because editors have to then ward off, learn things, because you can't say that without the lobbies or without the corporate sector coming into it, news can be had. So for information, you need to have them, but you need to have them at an arm's length.
What do you think differentiates a good newspaper from an average one?
Well, a good newspaper is, as you define news, is that it provides you information and does not stop at providing information. It goes on to give you what is behind that information. So if a newspaper carried a story during, say, election period, that such and such minister is coming for campaigning tomorrow. Now that's information which you can have, may or may not need it. Your readers, maybe you are helping the supporters of that particular leader to assemble at a particular point to listen to him or her, which is information.
Are newspapers more and more driven by advertisement or money considerations rather than editorial qualities?
But that's an area of concern. A lot of people are saying and witnessing how the front pages of newspapers are being replaced, where the news is being replaced by advertisement. Now, if you look at history, it wasn't always that the front page was news. 80 years back, the front page of a newspaper was advertisement. It was replaced by news during the freedom struggle, because there was so much happening with Jawaharlal Nehru and Mahatma Gandhi and Sardar Patel and everyone, and Jinnah and Muslim League and Congress and everybody around. People had real interest in information, in news. That's how news replaced advertising on the front page. Obviously, corporate or money power wasn't that great at that time. Maybe it was used for a different reason, that you had advertisement on the front page and the news began from page 3. Page 3 has a different connotation in today's world. Now, that changed during the freedom movement. News replaced advertising on the front page, but of late, and I would say that after 1990, after the economic liberalization was set in, it started changing again. So money power started dictating, and that's also a reason I had already mentioned, that you had money power influencing editors. If the advertising department today walks up to the editor and says that on the front page I need this much of a space for an advertisement, well, it will be really difficult for editors to say no to it, because their salaries, the money and everything, and the arguments that an advertising company would, or the advertising representative of the newspaper itself would put forward, would be very difficult to say for any editor that you don't want it.
So, a newsroom decides which news stories have a news value and should become part of the newspaper. They look at the following intrinsic qualities, or what we can call news values, before making a decision. How much impact has a news story got on its target readership? The scale of an event and the impression it leaves on its readers is an indicator of the impact a story has. Stories achieve prominence if they are contemporary. There is no point in publishing yesterday's news today because the readers would have come across it anyway through other media. The most prized possessions of a daily are its exclusive stories. It is given prominence and attracts largest number of readers and also helps build a newspaper's reputation. Journalism is about people rather than things, so the stories of the most vulnerable attract the most attention. So children in difficult situations, celebrities falling from grace, and stories with a human aspect are always popular. Wars, clashes, disagreements, disputes make for news. Natural disasters, accidents, and stories with the wow factor are selected. Issues in public domain which are hotly debated become important. Where the event is taking place also decides how much prominence it would get. Those events which are far removed from the cultural context of the newspaper reader will not find place in that newspaper. Easy to understand stories get priority over hard to explain ones. So those stories which are easy to comprehend get priority. Apart from these factors, the newsroom also decides on what news to take on the basis of competition, production needs, their readership profile, and so on. Journalism is much more than just talking to a few persons, writing a report, and publishing it. Good journalism is just not about filling space in a newspaper. If the press has to live up to the credentials of being the fourth estate, it has to be as good as the legislature, executive, or the judiciary, or one can argue even better than them. Since a journalist does not just tell it as it is, but also builds public opinions, molds them, and so can impact policy decisions of governments in a democracy. In this episode, we looked at what is news and how does a newsroom function. We found out that newsroom is the nerve center of a newspaper. It functions like a well-oiled machinery where everyone has to play its part. So, everyone from the sub-editor to the editor has a definite role. And a newspaper comes out only with the collaborative effort of all those involved in it. The factors which help in deciding what is news. The character and reputation of a newspaper is built by exclusive stories the reporters provide. And often, factors like advertising, competition, demand, and new media have an impact on the decision of the newsroom. And it is the task of the newsroom to sift news from propaganda and also try to maintain objectivity. Therefore, the newsroom is a nerve center of a newspaper. This is all we have for you in this episode. Thank you so much for listening. Have a good day.